Hate to see it. NES Works moves beyond 87 with Renegade. NES Works is not back, I'm afraid. I don't intend to kick off NES Works 1988 in earnest until sometime next year. If nothing else, I still have a few odds and ends to cover in 87 first. However, the very first game release for the 88 chronology is Technos Japan's Renegade. And as it happens, there's a Game Boy Works episode in the near future that really demands an explanation of Renegade's history in order to properly make sense. So here we are with the very second ever Technos game to come to NES. The first, of course, was Tag Team Wrestling, and much as with that game, Renegade is about large, sweaty men pummeling one another, except it's actually kind of not. We've seen a few Japanese titles that were visually overhauled for US release so far, mostly Bandai titles designed around anime properties that the company didn't feel like licensing for the US. Renegade stands among these, yet it also stands out for a few different reasons. For starters, Renegade isn't based on an existing media property. Its localization revisions are about culture rather than copyright. Secondly, Renegade's facelift is vastly more comprehensive than, say, Chubby Cherubs. Rather than redrawing the protagonist's sprite or even the protagonist and a few enemies, practically every single graphical element in Renegade differs from its counterpart in the Japanese release. The two releases play almost exactly alike, but they look very different. Even more remarkably, both the Japanese and US localizations would go on to inspire their own unique series. It's a lot like the Adventure Island Wonder Boy thing, which we'll explore later in NES Works 1988, though thankfully it's less confusing. In any case, Renegade is the beginning of not one but two video game legacies, all of which can be traced back to Technos Japan and a guy named Yoshihisa Kishimoto. In designing Renegade for arcades, Kishimoto looked back into his own past and his teenage years spent as a punk, mixing it up with other delinquents. That doesn't really come through in Renegade, the American and European face of Kishimoto's game. Over here, his work had more of a The Warriors and Streets of Fire thing going on. Grown street punks mixing it up in subways. It's the Japanese version of the game that speaks to Kishimoto's own experiences. Neketsu Koha Kunio-kun, or Hot-Blooded Delinquent Kunio. The Japanese version of this game is undeniably Japanese, largely revolving around what are clearly teens wearing what are very definitely school uniforms. Protagonist Kunio himself wears a white uniform, brawling with kids from rival schools, including their bancho, Riki. The action begins on an outdoor subway platform, not in a subway, in the heart of Tokyo's busiest station, Shinjuku. It moves along to the Yokohama waterfront, and then to a seedy inner-city alley where he mixes it up with a gang of rogue schoolgirls, including their giant Sukeban boss. Eventually, you rumble with what appear to be thugs from a Zaibatsu who are clearly meant to be a proxy for Yakuza. All of these things are very much in line with Japanese pop culture themes and cliches of the 70s and 80s. Kunio wears a pompadour, the girl gang wears extremely long skirts and baggy blouses to reflect the fact that Sukeban were inspired in part by protest about the overly sexualized depiction of women in media, and then there's the fact that the final boss carries a firearm, which speaks to his craven and lawless personality. So you can see why Neketsu Koha Kunio-kun had to become Renegade. In the 80s, very few people outside of Japan had a frame of reference for the visual and cultural identity the game spoke to. It wasn't enough to change the text on background signs to English and turn the protagonist's skin pinkish rather than olive tone. The game required a comprehensive overhaul. For Americans, gang culture is less a rebellion against cultural conformity than it is the result of a system designed to fail minority groups and force them into the extreme circumstances of poverty. Even the final boss's use of a firearm speaks differently to an American audience. Rather than representing a shocking betrayal of cultural mores, he comes off as the one guy who remembered his constitutional rights and would probably be exonerated in court for killing the player character under the Castle Doctrine. But even if Renegade doesn't speak to its creator's own personal experience recast through manga tropes, it speaks to the audience through the familiar imagery of genre film. Renegade completely abandons its Japanese roots to become a gangland story in the hellish dystopia that was 70s and 80s New York City. A wholly fantastic premise, but nevertheless familiar to its target audience thanks to Saturday matinees and UHF television. But what was it about Kunio-kun that merited preservation? Why go to such pains to bring over a game that required such a comprehensive overhaul to work overseas? Simply put, this is a genre maker. Renegade is the inflection point of the brawler genre, the point at which the format began to take shape. It is the Super Mario Bros. Of its format. Not in terms of quality or timelessness, of course, but certainly in terms of impact. Renegade combines the left and right pugilism of Kung Fu with the playfield depth of tag team wrestling, along with some of that game's holds and submission moves, as a matter of fact. Unlike Kung Fu or Karateka, Renegade doesn't restrict players to 2 dimensions of movement. This is not a belt scroller where enemies come at you from both directions. Rather, it takes place in a faux 3D space that allows enemies to approach not only from either side, but also from above and below. While you can only attack left and right, moving into and out of the screen allows you to slip past enemy defenses and position yourself more advantageously. As a result, enemies tend to attack in smaller numbers and more slowly. You don't take them out in a single hit, but rather have to wear down their stamina and connect enough times to knock them down before they're taken out of the fight. This premise would go on to become perhaps the single most popular arcade gaming concept of the late 80s, inspiring the likes of Final Fight, Streets of Rage, and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And it all began here, in an admittedly rough form, but one whose fundamentals were all present from the start. Renegade's hero, Kunio, or Mr. K in the US version, fights a bit differently than the protagonists of most later brawlers. Rather than having separate buttons for punches and kicks, the 2 buttons of the NES controller determine the direction in which you attack, a bit like the way it worked in Section Z. Here, Mr. K's actions are contextual based on the direction he's facing. An attack while facing an enemy activates as a punch, whereas acting against an enemy approaching from behind Mr. K will cause him to lash out with a back kick. Additionally, you can take a flying jump kick at enemies by pressing both attack buttons together. While enemies are downed, you can pin them and punch them into submission as they lay stunned. You can also grab enemies and punish them with a knee kick, or throw them over your shoulder, injuring anyone you happen to hit in the process. It's a pretty basic setup, but even now the genre works around these same principles with a handful of embellishments in each game to put a specific twist on things. As such, a game of Renegade takes about 15 minutes to complete. That is, assuming you can actually finish it. Given its simplicity, Renegade does not go out of its way to play fair. The replay value it provides mostly comes from bad guys' fondness for ganging up on players, getting in unfair hits, stun-locking Mr. K by interrupting your inputs, or even grabbing him so another punk can land a few cheap blows. Enemies basically come in 3 types here: basic fighters, weapon fighters, and bosses. All 4 stages of the game consist of a scenario or 2 where you fight off multiple waves of fighters and weapon users before advancing to the boss. The scrub enemies vary somewhat from stage to stage, growing cannier and more dangerous with each round, but the only real combat variety comes from bosses. Each boss has his or her own quirks. The first boss can punch faster than Mr. K, while the extremely large lady in the Cheongsam at the end of stage 3 can lift Mr. K off the ground and slap him unconscious. And of course the final boss has a gun, which is a one-hit kill. Each enemy has effectively a hidden hit point value similar to Mr. K's life meter, and each hit you land saps a little of their stamina. If you land several consecutive blows, you'll knock your opponent down, but a foe who goes down before running out of stamina will get back up a few seconds later. During the rabble waves, 3 enemies will show up on screen at a time, and once you clear away one opponent, another will show up to take their place until you've wiped out the entire gang. Bosses you fight alone, presumably due to technical limitations of the hardware. In the arcade, each boss was accompanied by henchmen to up the difficulty level. That's not the only compromise the NES game suffers from. The backgrounds have been simplified and tons of background details, including the gang cheering their fellows as you're attacked by guys on motorcycles, have been omitted. On the other hand, the NES port does mix things up slightly for some added complexity. Renegade loses some superfluous details from the arcade, but it manages to contain all the coin-ops content, including a one-off motorcycle chase. Stages 3 and 4 provide players with some newly added variability too. Rather than simply punching your way to the boss, you have to find them behind the correct door. You can complete stage 3 by overcoming one of 2 final encounters, either through a rumble in a bar with a bunch of girls or against a gigantic sukeban. But stage 4 feels almost like the puzzle maze of Super Mario Bros. Final level. Completing each combat scenario presents you with 2 or 3 doors, and there's only one correct path to the true boss. Take the wrong set of doors and you end up back at the start of the stage, where you're forced to overcome the same old mooks again. Only by memorizing the proper route can you truly complete the game, assuming you can survive that long on 3 lives and no continues. That's probably fair though. It's a short and simplistic game, and you can more or less finish it in a single go by abusing the jump kick maneuver. Kite enemies into running towards you, then take a leap to leave a boot print on their face, repeat infinitely, win. Again, shallow design and brevity of content notwithstanding, Renegade was a major release in its day, and they're still making sequels to it. After Renegade, Kishimoto began to develop a sequel to the Western localization in its Streets of Fire vibe, which would ultimately turn into Double Dragon. Meanwhile, other teams and the Techno staff followed up on the original Kunio-kun aspect of the game, reworking the gang punk style with a cute and highly distinctive art style that would stray pretty heavily from the nuts and bolts combat design of this game in favor of things like intramural sports and role-playing adventures. Kunio and his rival Riki, aka Mr. K and Jack, remain mainstays of the franchise, which has survived 2 sell-offs in the wake of Technos Japan's bankruptcy in 1996. Current owner Arc System Works has kinda gone hog wild with the franchise, which doesn't always work out well, but does sometimes result in things like River City Girls. As for the Renegade brand, it's largely forgotten. The game did see a pair of off-brand sequels from European licensor Ocean, something that may seem a little familiar after the RoboCop episode of Game Boy Works, and one of which will eventually show up here on NES Works. But we'll also be seeing plenty of the game's spiritual successor Double Dragon, about 10 episodes from now. And we'll encounter a rare instance of Double Dragon and Kunio actually merging back together again soon on Game Boy Works. In the meantime, there's Renegade, the original Rumble in the Bronx. Or maybe Manhattan? It's kinda hard to say. Next time on NES Works, this is he, God's chosen ones, come to save us from all our oppressors.